It was the first to make use of leitmotif. Does anybody know about leitmotif? Leitmotif, yes, Daryl.
So it goes back to Wagner, right?
Yes, it does.
A particular, usually a sound, a note, a small phrase associated with a particular character. I mean, everybody thinks of it. For example, Prokofiev's Peter and the Wolf is a classic, is a more popular example.
Or maybe a dorsal fin cresting the water, and you hear...
Yes, precisely.
Or Darth Vader.
And you can do all sorts of things with them. If two characters you can meet, you can have the juxtaposition of their characteristic phrases.
You'll be hearing a whistling passage in here that is associated with the Peter Lorre character. That whistling passage is Peer Gynt, Hall of the Mountain King. It's very distinctive. Now, one of the problems that Peter Lorre had, he was a superb actor, but he wasn't much of a whistler. He didn't know how to whistle. So anytime you're whistling here, it's actually Fritz Lang whistling. It is not Peter Lorre. This is the first non-Jack the Ripper serial killer movie. Now, serial killer movies now have become their own genre. They're actually quite popular. We have a serial killer series. But at the time, other than Jack the Ripper, the world had not seen a serial killer on film. So this was a real shock to a lot of people. This is what you would call the first police procedural. We're actually looking at the process the police are going through to get the bad guy. We know who the bad guy is, well, it's going the bad guy, but we know who the killer is pretty early on in the film. Now, at the time in American cinema, I would say probably through the 30s and most of the 40s, it would have been a matter of not knowing who is killing all these kids, and then at the end everyone's gathered together in a room, and then someone says, I know the name of the killer, and his name is, and lights go out, and suddenly, yeah, right. So you don't have a scene like that here. Here we know the killer very, very quickly. It's not a matter of who done it, but is, now that we know who done it, what you going to do about it? This is the first starring role for Peter Lorre. He had done a few small pieces on film before, but you might as well say this is his debut. Everything he did before was it was either a very small part or a little 15 minutes short. So this is pretty much his debut. This is the all-time first film to use narration. Oh, it's the first and final film that Peter Lorre did with Lang. Lang was known as, well, I think we're all adults here, I think I can probably say it. He was an asshole. He was a real jerk. Almost everybody who worked with him loathed him. You don't see that much repeats in his cast. Peter Lorre was knocked about pretty hard on this film. There's some scenes and some steps that got taken over and over and over and over, and he resented that bitterly. So 20 years later, when they were both in America, Lang was trying to get another project on with Lorre, and most thanks for the thanks. And this is the first film to use voiceover narration. It had not been done up to that point. And the voiceover that you hear in here will be Fritz Lang talking. So you will hear his voice in German. And it is the first film to use actual criminals, as far as I know. And this is not something that you catch in most films. I don't know what films had previously, but there's going to be a scene where you're going to be seeing a lot of criminals gathered. Now, there will be some speaking roles in there, and those speaking roles are done mostly by professional actors. But all those tough-looking mugs in the background are the actual criminal scum of Berlin at the time. The story goes, and Lang repeated this several times, we don't know if it's really true, but the story goes that during the filming, the police raided the film set to try to capture all these underworld thugs. There was a tip-off from the police, and they all went running. It was actually quite a scene. Now, let's take a look at reactions to it. One of the first reactions came from a German man by the name of Joseph Goebbels. Joseph Goebbels really liked the film a lot. He described it as fantastic, free of phony humanitarian sentiments. Now, the interesting thing about that is that Lang said he meant it as a plea against capital punishment, although looking at the film, it's kind of hard to ferret that all out. But Goebbels was very impressed with it, and he was so impressed that eventually, over the next year or so, he actually offered the position of head of National Socialist Film to Fritz Lang. Now, Fritz Lang refused that. He actually always loathed the Nazis. And he explained that he couldn't because his mother was Jewish. To which Goebbels replied, "We decide who is Jewish and who isn't." And that actually was so. There is another cast member in this film who worked a lot during the Nazi times. And he had a wife who was Jewish. But he had a special pass from Goebbels, a special exemption. Even though she was Jewish, she kind of wasn't. So, now eventually, the Nazis just didn't like Lang much at all, and their feeling was mutual. So eventually, the Nazis decided to ban the film in 1934. Now, I think they banned the film in 1934. Daryl, you've got a movie. It's The Testament of Dr. Mabuse.
Yeah.
Mabuse. Mabuse. Okay. Testament of Dr. Mabuse. Now, that film was meant as a broadside of the Nazis, and the Nazis got it real fast. In that film, a psychotic criminal mastermind is put in prison. Now, Dale, does he die in prison? Or is he just confined?
He's confined and supposedly crazy, but he does die later. Yes.
Right, but he is able...
He lives on through hypnotic...
His mind is so powerful, he's able to control the events around him and still controls the criminal underworld around him, even though he's in jail. Now, the Nazis saw that as a parable for Hitler, who, even though he was in jail, was still very active in running the Nazi Party, had written Mein Kampf, which was sort of the playbook the Nazis played with, and so the Nazis recognized exactly what he was doing. And that was enough. In 1934, he fled. Now, he fled, his wife didn't, but we'll talk about that in just a bit. So the film was banned, however. It's not as though it was entirely banned, because eventually we did see it again. In 1940, the Nazis released something called The Eternal Jew. And in that film, there was a scene from M. The Jew Laurie in the role of a child murderer, following the motto, not the murderer, but the murdered is guilty, it is tried to contort the normal sense of justice and to excuse and lessen the crime with a compassion-inducing portrayal of it. So I think that's actually rather cheeky. The Nazis are denouncing murder. Okay. Compassion-inducing should be. Now, the film was also a hit on this side of the Atlantic as well. And one of the people who screened it was Irving Thalberg. Thalberg loved it. He had a special screening at MGM, and he called all his writers to it, and all the producers. And he demanded to know why they were bringing him films of that power and caliber. And when he was confronted, he did admit that if anybody brought him a story of a child killer, he would never, ever accept it. So there you have it. Now let's take a look at the consequences of the film. Now, as a result of this film, or I guess actually after the film, Peter Lorre, who was persecuted in the film, in real life was fleeing persecution and left Nazi Germany. In 1934, he made the man who knew too much over in England. And then after that, he came to the States, and of course, he established a very long and productive career in film and in radio and eventually on television, and apparently he met his friend Sam there somewhere. Another character you see in the film is the guy who plays the king of criminals, Gustav Grudgens' name. Now, interestingly enough, just the way Laurie in some ways wound up fulfilling his character, the fleeing, persecuted, fearful character, Grudgens did as well. He played the king of the criminals in the film, and in real life he became one of the favorites of the Nazis. He continued to work right through the whole Nazi era until his death in 1963. Fritz Lang, of course, fled Germany in 1934. He settled in Hollywood and became part of a really interesting German expatriate community here. It would be interesting to do an evening one day just on that expatriate community. You had guys like Billy Wilder and William Dearly and Otto Preminger and, well, of course, Fritz Lang.
Thomas Mann.
Yes, Thomas Mann. Also, somebody else who was trained there who was trained in UFA Studios in Germany originally, who wound up in the United States, was this British director by the name of Hitchcock. He cut his teeth originally in German silence before he started making movies in England. So there was a very interesting, very active community, and actually it was their sense, their training from German abstract expressionist films that would eventually lead to film noir in the 40s. But if you look at the films they were doing in the 20s and 30s, they look an awful lot like the 40s film noir we would see a decade later after the war, but actually beginning during the war. Thea von Harbo divorced Lange in 1933. The following year, she joined the Nazi Party, and she remained an ardent supporter of the Nazis all through their reign. She was put in prison briefly after the war and got out, and she continued making films until her death in 1954. Interestingly enough, after M, there were 3 more films that I guess you could say Lange worked on with Harbo, but they were in the 1960s. It was after her death. She'd written some novels that had been filmed in Germany earlier in the 1930s. He remade them in the early 60s. And he hated them. I've never seen them, but I understand they're not much to look at. Now, as far as the rest of the cast in M, I had always suspected that certainly with all the turmoil that was to come, there must be some of the people in this cast who were swept up either in the Holocaust, or perhaps conscripted into the military, or had to flee the country, and perhaps that is the case. However, I have individually tracked down, I think it was about 78 cast members on this, both people who were credited and people who were uncredited. Now, there were several people whose birth and death dates I just simply cannot find. So it's possible they were armed. But of all the people I've been able to find, I have not found anyone who looked obviously like they might have been a death in World War II, or during World War II. There were some very elderly people who died before the war. Perhaps it had something to do with the Holocaust, but you know, when you're 78 years old and you die in 1934, 35, 78-year-old people just die sometimes, unfortunately. So I can't really attribute anything directly. I have not found anything that tells me that, what happened in terms of World War II and the people you're about to see in the film. Now, as far as the movie itself, however, M was made again. M was made in 1951 as an American film, and the Peter Lorre part went to David Wayne. Now, I've never seen the film, and I had read about the film before, and I thought, oh my God, no way. David Wayne? Ooh. But I've read reviews of people who have seen it, and they said it is surprisingly good. That David Wayne is able to capture that sort of vibe that Peter Curtin had originally. The very mild-looking, nice-appearing man who is a serial killer. If you want to criticize Lorre's performance, I don't think there's much you can criticize of him. But he just looks dangerous all the time. This little puffy-faced, bulgy-eyed guy always looks like it may be a problem. But David Wayne, probably not so much. Now, interestingly enough, there is a name that I mentioned earlier on that I'm repeating here. This was directed by Joseph Lucy, the same guy that produced Lange many years later in Contempt in 1963. Unfortunately, the film did not play very long theatrically. About a month before it was released, Joseph Lucy was blacklisted. And he wound up fleeing to Europe, and I don't think he ever came back to this country. In 1981, the American Bar Association named M one of the 10 best trial films of all time, which is rather curious when you see the trial scene in there. Those of you who haven't seen it, that might make you raise your eyebrows later on. In 2004, it was chosen by the Association of German Cinematics as the most important German film of all time. And then, of course, there's the way I like to think of it. In 2007, Premiere voted this film one of the 25 most dangerous films, and I heartily agree with that. Now, there's a few questions I would like you to think about during the course of the film. And we're going to close with those. Did you see any signs in the movie that would indicate the decline of the Weimar Republic? Did you see any foreshadowing of the Third Reich in it? Did you see any possible film noir roots in the film? And Can you tell me who is the antagonist and who is the protagonist?